Stories are the software of our lives. We as the humans, the hardware, need an upgrade of our spiritual software, our stories, our wisdom, more than ever. Each of these episodes will be like a performance psychologist, philosopher, religious professor, and a monk walked into a bar and had a conversation. It's just me on this podcast because that's the weird conversation that's happening in my brain. I'll be drawing from other wisdom traditions, but each episode will be drawing from one main tradition, the Bible. I'll be drawing from 40 stories. And as I look at these 40 stories, I'll be distilling it down so that you can find the wisdom you need to help upgrade your story wherever you find yourself. The polycontemplative approach is not dedicated to any belief system or ideology. It's an invitation for all of us to pay attention to wisdom that's been passed down our way for thousands of years and learn from it in a new, fresh way today. Welcome to what is my boldest, scariest project yet. And I'm not trying to finish anything with this project. I just want to start something. I know for myself, and a number of people I've talked to and processed this with, we're at so much of a crossroads, it feels like, in human consciousness. This is going to be a big, ambitious project, I know. Are we advancing or are we not? And for so many of us right now, we're facing so much challenge and unnerving. So many of the narratives and stories and cultural heritages that we grew up with are being overturned and changed. And I see this tension point where we're trying to get to a greater wisdom. And we're discarding stories, ancient stories, that have offered us so much wisdom. We've not been able to separate out the superstition from the holistic cognitive activation that these stories can provide for us. They will surface a deeper, more true awareness and wisdom that we can currently access on our own. What do I mean by that? I mean, what we're going to be doing in this podcast is walking through 40 stories from the Bible and combinations of stories. And there's no agenda here or ideology. There's no being atheist or conservative or Republican or Democrat or liberal or even just trying to deconstruct. That's not the point. There's plenty of resources out there doing that. Instead, what I'm attempting to do in this project is bring the weird combination that I feel in my own heart and mind and processing a story just to kick off a conversation. In my own life, and in my work experience and professional experience and nerding out and obsessions, I've been this weird combo of really kind of four realities. The philosopher who's thinking and writing books about what it means to live our best lives. The religious professor, and I did that for a stint, and what it means to be able to deconstruct and rebuild stories and understand the power of myth. And I don't mean myth by true or false. I mean myth by like big stories that pull us in and shape us. And what it means to think about things from a psychological perspective. And I've been obsessed with that for years and now coach our certified coaches as they coach others to help people dial in their mindset. And from a psychology standpoint, be at their absolute best. And then from my own obsession with the number of times that people in different phases of my life have called me a monk, because I've really tried to pay attention to spiritual practices and what it means to explore and experiment to find out what is the human potential within. And as I've done that journey and continue to do that journey, to see a merging of so many traditions, ancient wisdom traditions from the East and the West, and to have a foot in two worlds of what it means to know the depth of an identity and an individualism apart from any other markers of race or creed or gender or sexuality, but also to see all the illusion that we find in an approach that the East offers, where things are more than what they seem. And what I look to do in this project is walk through some stories with you that we can take the wisdom away, that we can look at it from these different filters, and in some way take the wisdom they offer, push against the box of what we've been offered. See, I think about us as humans. We are the hardware, and we need the software of stories. Software, spiritual software. And these stories are ready to upgrade us if we can read them in a new way. So as we dive into this first episode, I want you to see that everything new and now is really ancient. The ancient now paradigm or paradox of our three great struggles. Now, to understand how I'm walking through this first episode, I want to start at a different point in the story than you may have started before. See, what happens for a lot of us is we start to build out our understanding of who we are in humanity. I told you, a big project, I know. We've started that like we've walked into the movie too late. What would it be like if you walked into the movie WALL-E right at the end? And as you walk in, you know, they're getting off the ship and they're seeing the planet that they now are going to repopulate. So much of the story wouldn't make sense. Or to walk into Finding Nemo late when this fish is looking for another fish. There's no context that a dad is looking for a son. And for so many of us, we've walked into the movie late because we know some of the themes, but we've missed the bigger underlying ideas that have always been there. I know I did for a long time. See, if you're going to go to the beginning and you're going to go to Genesis, again, we're not about an agenda or an ideology or a superstition. We're just looking at the poem. And as we see in the poem, it's this rhythm of creation and the participation of humanity in that. And in that participation and in that creation, this conflict point that we come to, that really everything hinges on, is a change in state of the human. I'm going to talk more about a component that contributed to that change in state. But first, I just want you to focus on the change in state. It was 6 days. And then on the seventh day, there was rest because it was good. So again, I'm not weighing in on the whole debate because I think that's ridiculous and a waste of time and doesn't help us. This is a poem, and it teaches us to look in big sweeping views at this rhythm of good, 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 good. The movie begins with a goodness, and that goodness is captured in the state of the human. And here's how it's recorded. They were naked and they felt no shame. Now, this is a profound idea to me. And to really explore the depth of this idea, I want to hit the pause button on where we're tracking for just a second to remind you that for all of human history, right, this long arc of evolutionary history, stories were told around the fire way before they were written down. So we can look at the stories that have had the most enduring hold on our imagination as holding something important. See, what we know is stories shape us. As we engage stories, as we live stories, as we're guided by the metaphors, we are impacted by their power on our mindset. And just as we know stories shape us, these ancient humans at different points and epochs realized, stories shape us. We must shape the stories. So I see these stories that have endured because they hold a transfer of wisdom. And one of the things that's just fascinating to me is this transfer of wisdom that happens right here, that they were both naked and felt no shame. There's an emphasis here on a word, feeling. Shame. I mean, isn't this wild that human history, this story that's held so much sway over our minds, is emphasizing a feeling state of shame? Now, you need to know, when you're reading, you're always reading someone's interpretation because you're reading a translation. That's just a reality. So you can go out and do some research, and you can start to study, as I have, the Greek and the Hebrew. You can start to pick these apart. I feel like I've lived a number of different lives. One of those journeys for a while was actually studying the original languages. I got to where I could sight read the Greek New Testament. So I am encouraging you to search this out for yourself. But even after I had taken that journey and studied for years, in fact, I already had a master's degree in the path that I was in at that time, a master's of divinity, and I had a whole theological library that I'd been building. I still missed that huge phrase. They felt no shame. They felt no shame. I missed it. And when I saw it for the first time, and saw it deeply. I remember I turned around and I looked at my theological library and I started to go through the books and start to see and look for in the back where they would list all the words, all the times that shame would have been listed. And it was wild to me to see instance after instance in these books where shame was never listed. Why is that? Now, my reaction may have been too sharp or harsh, but I was disgusted at how I'd felt lied to. This big idea had been skipped over. So I actually gave my theological library away. I still remember this lady was standing on the porch of our house at the time. She was like, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yeah, just take them." I'd put it on Craigslist for somebody to come get them. She was like, "Well, I'm going to go sell these and pay for my daughter's tuition." And I'm like, "Great. What a cool way to give back." Either way, what happened to me in that moment, and it really was a before-after experience with the power of this concept, that I was like, nobody's told me about how huge this was. And so I started searching it out. It was really crazy to me when I found that throughout Western history, there was an emphasis on another word called guilt. And guilt was a minor part to the story. Shame was a major part to the story. You can think about guilt this way. Guilt's when you feel bad about what you've done. It's appropriate. If you do something that's harmful to others, that you need to feel guilty about, or harmful to yourself, then you're judging your performance in a healthy way and going, I don't need to do that anymore. That's guilt. And I want to feel better, so how can I make it right? What's not helpful for us is shame. Shame is when you feel bad about who you are. Now, this is where this gets really interesting. Because in the story it says, they felt no shame. And the fulcrum point of the story is an action they take, and then everything changes because they feel shame. In fact, the action they take, we're not going to dive into this just yet because that's going to be the second big idea we're going to look at in a minute, is they eat from this tree. Now, before we dive into the conversation about what this tree was about, why were these ancient humans telling this story? Were they really thinking that some kind of sacred influence, God, whatever you name it, was mad if they ate a certain kind of fruit? There's more there. We're going to get there. For now, I want you to see they went from feeling no shame to shame. See, here's what changed for them. When they went from feeling no shame to shame, the man does what a man does, feeling that shame, he blames. He blames his wife in that moment. He blames Eve. As they sense God is coming near, they're used to going on a walk with God in the cool of the garden. Now, as I'm going to use the term God in different terms throughout this crazy wild project I'm doing, I still kind of can't believe I'm doing it, but here I am. As I use these terms, I don't have an associated meaning to those terms that you might have. And I'm going to offer you some ways of thinking about these terms that are really expansive and big when we get into episode 3 of what we're going to do together in this journey. And if you're at a place right now where God or no God is, a part of your journey, it doesn't matter to me. I just want you to see the power of this concept of shame. Now, if you are in a place where you're trying to relate to the sacred in some way, just know that if you can outgrow your concept of the sacred, then there's something happening there that you might be surprised to find. You've been told to think some certain ways about things, and there might be more to it. So we're going to cover that as we hit other episodes in this project. But that's why I call this project polycontemplative. Just like polymaths, those kind of special people got us here and helped us with so many technological breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs. We also in our world today need polycontemplatives. We need polycontemplatives, people who can take these ancient stories from whatever tradition, and I'm using the Western tradition, glean the wisdom, take out what helps us from a cognitive activation, and remove the superstition. So if we look at this story and we understand what's really happening here, that the human goes from no shame to shame, we find that ancient people for thousands of years thought one of the most important things you could understand is the concept of shame. And as I looked at my theological workbooks and found that this concept had been glossed over, I wanted to know why. So I went on a search. And I went on a search, and you know what I found that was really crazy? That when the African-American slave trade was happening, and slaves were brought over to the States, and they were put into plantations, the white owners would try to indoctrinate them with Christianity and how they should be a good slave. Taking passages because, hey, as we see in this project through 40 episodes, there's some weird stuff there. We're going to talk about some of that weird stuff, because what does it mean to be able to look at a text and to understand it? And we're going to talk about what's beyond the text. But for a lot of people, they're locked into the text. And if you don't know how to walk through something in a way that you can suspend judgment and look at multiple viewpoints, a text can be toxic because it locks in certain kinds of thinking. Sadly, what had happened to the white slave owners, they had locked into a Christianity that allowed them to defend and even bolster their viewpoint of slavery. Now, here's what's fascinating to me. If you're ripped from your home, if you go through that horrible process of the Middle Passage as they were on these ships, treated like less than human, like animals, would you want to have anything to do with the religion of the people that brought you over? No, absolutely. You wouldn't want to have anything to do with that religion. And yet, what's so fascinating to me is not only did the African American people take Christianity as their spirituality, they actually got it better and deeper than what they were given. We know in their hush harbors, the way that they would crouch down and sing their spirituals and have their sermons, they were able to relate to so much more of the biblical arc and Old Testament stories. And I know there's a lot of funk there. And we're going to pick a lot of those apart and look at the wisdom as we go through this process, not to deconstruct, but to find the wisdom. They were able to go through these stories and connect with them in a way that the Western church never was able to. And I'll tell you why. The first few hundred years of Christian history, they were not in power. And so they had a holistic concept of the human, which was more about shame than guilt. Shame is the bigger issue. Guilt's a small issue. Even as this was referred to in the Gospels, to be forgiven, it wasn't about the removal of guilt alone. It was about the restoration of who you were as a person. It was the removal of shame. It's a massive theme, massive idea. But as Christianity came to power, sadly, this is what happened. As they were persecuted by pagans, as they came to power, some of them persecuted pagans. See, what happens over and over and over in religion, if it doesn't open you up and expand you and put you on a journey to a greater humanity, a greater consciousness, then you can fall into the traps that humans continue to fall into. All religions, all over, the big ones anyway, persecute other big religions. Because the human has something in them. It started good. The story started good, but there's a flaw. And what is that flaw? What is that potential for evil? What is that brokenness? It's shame. And so all attempts at change that try to change things from top-down systems won't work in the long term, because that's someone else's ideology forced on another person. The way society has continued to move forward through humanity is when we deal with our shame as individuals first and grow and expand. Is this clean or easy? No, it's messy. I mean, right now, as I record this at my home, I'm not getting together with other people in my neighborhood. And we have somewhat of a multicultural neighborhood, and that's really fun. But I'm not getting together with people in my neighborhood and saying, hey, let's go over there to the other neighborhood and we're going to pillage and we're going to burn it. We're going to go take from them. That would be atrocious. See, at some point in humanity, that would have been completely normal. But as humans have developed and grown, now we would look at that action and go, no, you don't do that. That's crazy. That's terrible. Humans move forward. We're just kind of locked in a place where we really haven't advanced at the pace we can. I see what's happened with so many different social causes, and it's beautiful and I celebrate it, but I also see the racism that's still there. And then I see the people reacting to racism and trying to bring top-down change. And it's always got to start with the individual. This is how humanity moves forward. And for it to start at the individual level, it's understanding this concept of shame. Shame is when you feel bad about who you are. Guilt's when you feel bad about what you've done. And every human I've ever talked to, if you can get them relaxed and honest, there's a place that they feel shame. And until they do work on their own worldview, they can't make their own meaning. For much of human society, we've just lived in whatever tribe we were a part of, cultural heritage, and that gave us our worldview. And now, for the first time in human history, there's so many ways you can build your identity. And by identity, I mean more than your race, more than your creed, more than your gender, more than your sexuality. We're going to journey into that concept as we go through this process also. Identity is so much more than maybe what you've ever thought of up to this point. But the starting point of the story is from no shame to shame. And as they move from no shame to shame, we find that the great solution here is to pursue freedom from shame, to make our own meaning. That no one else has to define for us what is right or wrong. That there is morality. There is a way that we want to think about treating our fellow humans. And that's what takes us to this second part of the story. See, after we understand that this transition happened from no shame to shame, we want to understand why it happened. Well, they were given these two trees in this story. And in this story, these two trees represented the choice that they could make. That they could eat from the tree of life or the tree of knowledge and of good and evil. Now, at face value, it seems like we would want the tree of knowledge and good and evil. Let's understand what's happening here. Well, to get this, we've got to go into the narrative. And in the narrative, there is this character, this snake. And there's so many different things we could unpack about this snake. And you should go check some of that out. That's what polycontemplatives do. They go research these things, go explore it. When I use the word polycontemplative, I do think of, it's gotten in my head because I've been thinking a lot about this project, a shorthand of pecans. Pecans, go and search it out, not pecans, like they say in the South sometimes. My grandparents in South Carolina had, when I would grow up and we go visit them, had pecan trees, and we get the pecans, and you'd eat pecan pie. But the pecans here, the pecans, the people that want to dive in and research, you can go look up some of this about what it meant for that snake to be in the tree. But that snake in the tree said something. Hey, you know why you're not supposed to eat from this? Because you're going to be like God. Here's the crazy thing about it. If you really understand the story and you look at the context, it's a big FOMO lie. They already were like God. The whole context of the picture is this garden where what you have or what you need is here. It's provided for. It's taken care of. It's this feeling. It's going to be okay. I got all I need. It's really what we're all looking for. I mean, that's the hunger. That's the drive. See, the reason this project is important for us right now at this time in human history is because we all worship. We're all hungry for something. We're all looking for a way to make our meaning. And if we don't understand shame, what happens is our hunger for making meaning goes into whatever we value most. Maybe it's my rights, maybe it's my freedoms, maybe it's my property, my land. The land has been a big one. Not just in the context of the West right now, but throughout thousands of years of human history. Let's go back to the example of what we saw in this issue of shame. See, what happened for the Western church, and it's why some of these concepts that I'm going to be talking about sound foreign, is because they had to obsess over guilt because they didn't feel a lot of shame in who they are at an awareness level. Instead, they had distanced themselves from it. It's always there. But as Christianity had power and it was in a context of power, then they could hyper specialize and divide and argue, and you have these different strands of church history forming and splitting, and any of them could have won out in different ways, and your experience of growing up in a Western context would look completely different, possibly Eastern too, as colonization happened and different movements spread across the planet. So what we see now is this world that we've lived in for a couple thousand years, where people have been eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil over and over, rather than the tree of life. What do I mean by that? I think the best way to explain that to you is what Ray Bradbury said when he said, thinking isn't living. Thinking is the container that holds living. We want to be the kind of people who live our lives, who bring an unobstructed expression of who we are, shame-free, so that we make our meaning, we work on our worldview, into what we do. And then we're able to live a life that we want to live. It's the overflow of our values, of our whole values, of our healthy choices. What it means to eat from the tree of life, not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is to be the kind of person who says, this is what it means for me. It may mean something different for you. We'll cover some of this in some of the other episodes, but this was why some of the factions that started to develop that are even recorded in the New Testament was because there were disagreements over what's right and what's wrong. And one of the early leaders basically was able to say, hey, there's a lot of gray that's happening. That's really the big idea. Over and over, you see this gray that's spoken to in different ways, and there's wisdom principles there too, and we'll cover that. What I want you to understand right now is the framing of the story, the ancient wisdom, was to pursue life over knowledge. You say, but knowledge is so important. Yeah, I love knowledge. Chris, aren't you breaking down knowledge in this project? Yeah, knowledge set me free. The number of times I've found something that I'm going to be sharing with you in this 40-episode journey that I was like, oh my gosh, how come nobody ever told me that? The knowledge is important, but the knowledge doesn't lead the dance. Life leads the dance. What's the next right step for me to take? It's following the compulsion, the intuition, the wisdom, and then letting the thinking support that, not lead it. I eat from the tree of life first, most of the time. Sometimes I get worried. Sometimes I get anxious. Sometimes I overthink things. Sometimes my left brain, which is good, it's good to have that, and it's a strength, starts to lead the dance and get too far ahead. And I start thinking about my life, not living my life. See, we're so consumed with trying to figure out life, we miss living it. And there's a wisdom there for us in this story. And as you read this story, you find, because they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, now they had shame. Now they judged. Now they evaluated themselves. Now they created a false concept of the sacred, ran and hid from it, even though they were used to walking with God in the garden. Adam starts to blame all of these things, hiding, right, that show up when we're feeling insecure and shameful. What happens? Well, the way the story is recorded is a covering is made for them. An animal skin is literally provided to them. And the sad understanding of a distorted viewpoint on this story is that the main power, the God, the sacred influence, needed them to wear the covering. That wasn't the case at all. The covering wasn't for God. The covering was for them. See, people that understand that shame is the greater ability to interpret the character arc and the story arc of what we're going to be looking through these 40 episodes, get the fact that that was relief for them in that condition. Because if they didn't have that relief, if they were swallowed up in their shame, what was going to happen? Well, this is the third part of the story. They would enact violence on each other. That's where we get to Cain and Abel. If you'll remember, if you've ever heard the story, or if you haven't, let me share it with you. Cain and Abel are two brothers who want to say to the sacred, to God, hey, here is our best offering. One offers a sacrifice of its or his first fruits, right? That was the phrase that was used. And I know it's weird to get your mind around this, but it was an agricultural world. And I'm going to make a comment about that in a minute. But for now, it was his best. It was the first of what he had. So it's not the leftovers, it's the first. And what Cain does is not offer that. Now, it's weird in the story, and if you study it and read it closely, you'll find some tension points here that I think are absolutely fascinating at what is said and what isn't. This story isn't here just so you can give money to an institution and keep it going. We're going to do a piece on institutions in a couple episodes. I'm not saying institutions are bad, but this story is about what it means for you. If you're shame-free and you're living your life, eating from the tree of life, how do you offer your best sacrifice to your world, to your people, to your advancement, to your healthy vision? Because if a vision is born of shame, it's going to be unhealthy. But if a vision is born shame-free, it's going to be powerful for others. Well, if you're not offering your best, what do? You resent the other. I mean, the reason we have so much violence is because we have so much shame. We have so much resentment. We have so much comparison. We see the other. And rather than being healthy and going out and impacting our community and building our community and actually changing systems, because remember we said change doesn't come from top-down systems, but it's from bottom-up. People changed. Rather than being powerful influencers of change in a healthy way, instead, what do? We enact violence against one another. And in these three big themes, we see when shame is present and we live judgment-based, living, where we're thinking, we're not pursuing the mission with perseverance, we become miserable. I mean, if you live your mission full out, shame-free, the greatest people or the greatest, most intense, painful attacks you'll experience are those from people who are not living theirs. Cain and Abel go to war at each other. The hate that I feel for you is the hate that I can feel for myself. Anytime I'm irritated with somebody or angry or frustrated, this story calls me into wisdom, to pay attention to my shame, to eat from the tree of life for my life, to not be the one that has to pass judgment. Obviously, there are things, if they're harming others, right? There's gray, but there are a few black and whites. But I look at this story and then I go, okay, I'm at war with this Abel. How does that speak to me as a Cain right now? See, when you get these three themes, it debunks the greatest dysfunctions that I see our society suffocating under right now. That we just make everything about a vacuous self-esteem. Self-esteem matters, but you got to separate shame from guilt and figure out where your performance matches up to the standards that you want for your life and where it doesn't. But it's built on the foundation of no shame. And what it means to understand that, there's going to be all kinds of people telling you what you should do in your life. But you got to find that for yourself. You got to eat from the tree of life for you, not from the tree of someone else's knowledge of good and evil. And then what does it mean for you to be the kind of person who doesn't just try to play and win status games, but instead you're the kind of person who goes out there and builds your own community? You need to know the rules of how the game works. You just have to. That's what Cain and Abel tells us. But you can play a better game. And that better game isn't just to win status games. That better game is to build a community of people around you, and you build it around them. Shame-free, eating from the tree of life, as you recognize the relationships that you can build. And the polycontemplative project, the pecans of what it means to look at the world this way, are the kind of people who have said, you know what? We're going to push against the box of the stories that we've been given. We want to understand them more. We want to explore them more. We want to glean the wisdom from them, but we want to upgrade them. Because as humans, we are the hardware. Our stories are the software, the spiritual software. And we need that upgrade of wisdom more than ever. It's been said that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. I can't imagine that that statement could say more succinctly what it means for us to find ourselves at so many different crisis points right now. And I know we're in a period of change that is massive, unprecedented, and faster every day. But I believe that disruption and change is going to continue for a while. Just as agriculturalism completely changed the world, and a lot of what we're talking about today in these stories came out of an agricultural context. The internet and our ability to be connected, we've barely tasted what that means. We haven't experienced the full disruption of it. The internet hasn't yet changed your work world the way that it will in massive ways, and it hasn't yet changed religion like it will. But we're starting to see that happen, and it's only going to accelerate. And we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's cliche, but true. We want to get the wisdom so that we can be the kind of people as polycontemplatives, pecans, the people who take from religious tradition like monks in our practice, the people who understand how to see the sociological trajectory of a religion as religious professors or understandings that we have, what it means to be philosophers and to think about values, and what it means to understand the psychology of how people grow and develop and combine all those together so we can take these ancient stories and let them guide us. Now, I won't be talking as much about the project as a whole in the other episodes. We'll just be diving into the stories. But as you contemplate the week ahead, what's it mean for you to understand when shame is driving? That's not who you are. You can, at the core, know a shame-free existence as you work on your worldview and make your own meaning. And to eat from the tree of life, that it's not about following the pressures and the shoulds so that you can not do violence to your brother or your sister. But as you would care for yourself, you care for them and you build your community. Thanks for being here. As polycontemplatives, let's keep searching for the wisdom, not settling for easy answers. Peace. Hey, thank you for being here and listening to this episode. Please feel free to rate and share the podcast with others. More importantly, I want to invite you to come to sightshift.com, SIGHT shift.com. There, I'm obsessively focused on helping people with 3 problems. Number 1, how to work on their worldview and make their own meaning. Number 2, how to find their place in the world and move with a laser-focused mission. And number 3, transcend status games and build the healthy community they want to be a part of. Through our platform of content, certified coaches, and community, we are transformational guides to help you find your wisdom. Join us at SightShift, SIGHT shift.com.